A jog turned battle. The first golden rays of sunlight stretched over Oakwood Park, filtering through the towering oaks and dappling the paved jogging trail in warm hues. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and freshly cut grass. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies weaving into the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood just beginning to stir. For Selena Grant, this was sacred, her daily run, a time to clear her mind before diving into the chaos of her work. Dressed in sleek black athletic wear, wireless earbuds nestled snugly in her ears, she ran with steady, measured strides. Her breathing was controlled, her movements fluid. At 38 years old, she had built a career that few dared to take on, head of internal affairs for the state police. It was a job that demanded resilience, a relentless pursuit of truth, and an unshakable spine. She had taken on the corrupt, challenged the powerful, and never once backed down. But for now, none of that mattered. This was her moment, her escape, until it wasn't. A slow-moving car caught her attention, the unmistakable blue and white of a police cruiser rolling along the park's edge, keeping pace with her. Selena's stomach tightened. She knew that gaze. She had seen it 100 times before. The silent judgment, the quiet suspicion. Even before she slowed her pace, she already knew. This wasn't about safety. This was about her. The gatekeeper officer, Thomas Hale, tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his expression darkening as he watched the woman jog. Something about the sight of her, a black woman, moving through this pristine, predominantly white neighborhood with quiet confidence, didn't sit right with him. He had patrolled Oakwood Park for years. In his mind, he was more than just an officer. He was its gatekeeper. His father, a decorated officer before him, had drilled certain beliefs into him from childhood. Not everyone belongs everywhere. Some people need to be reminded of that. And Hale had taken that lesson to heart. To him, Selena was out of place. His mind filled in the blanks without evidence, without logic. Maybe she was casing houses. Maybe she was one of those troublemakers who had no business in neighborhoods like this. His grip tightened. He'd seen enough. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights, swerving the cruiser in front of her path. Time to put her in her place. The stop, Selena slowed, frowning as the police car cut her off. A flicker of irritation crossed her face as she pulled out an earbud. Not again. The door swung open. Officer Hale stepped out, posture rigid, authority radiating from every fiber of his uniform. But it wasn't just authority. It was something sharper, something laced with an edge she knew too well. "Hey, you!" he barked, pointing straight at her. Selena's brows knit together. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" His voice was cold, clipped, demanding. Selena gestured to her running attire, her water bottle strapped to her waist. "I'm jogging." Her tone was calm, controlled, but he wasn't interested in her answer. "Don't get smart with me." His eyes burned with suspicion. "We got a report about a suspicious person matching your description. Trespassing, possibly involved in theft. Care to explain yourself?" Selena's breath caught in her chest. There it was. She had heard the words before, countless times, spoken in different places, different circumstances. But the message was always the same. You don't belong. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She met his stare, her voice unwavering. "Excuse me? I live around here. I jog this path every morning." But Hale didn't care about the truth. He had already decided what he wanted to believe. His arms folded, his lips curling into a smirk. "You got any ID on you?" Selena exhaled slowly, forcing her frustration down. "I left it at home. I wasn't expecting to need it for a run." Hale's smirk deepened, victory flashing in his eyes. "Convenient," he sneered. "So, no proof you live here. No ID. You know what that looks like, right?" A murmur rippled through the air. Selena's eyes flicked to the side. Onlookers had gathered. Some whispered, others filmed. This was becoming a scene. She drew a steady breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. I live 2 blocks from here. This is a misunderstanding." But Hale stepped closer, towering over her. "Misunderstanding?" His voice was dripping with mockery. "Look, lady, I don't have time for games. Either you cooperate, or we're going to have a problem." Selena felt it then. The weight of every unjust encounter, every humiliation, every moment where people like Hale abuse their badge to feed their own prejudice. Her jaw tightened. Enough! Her voice, still quiet but laced with authority, cut through the air like a blade. "Officer, I'm going to ask you to think carefully about what you're doing. A warning, a chance, a way out before it got worse." But Hale's expression darkened, mistaking her composure for defiance. His hand hovered near his belt. "Oh? Is that a threat?" His voice was sharp, eager. "You think you can intimidate me?" Selena held her ground, and in that moment, the game changed, because he had no idea who she was. The turning point. The whispers grew louder. The phone stayed lifted. And then, from behind the crowd, another voice cut through the tension. "Officer Hale!" The voice was firm, steady. A second patrol car had pulled up unnoticed. Another officer stepped forward, a senior official, his expression unreadable. Hale stiffened. The officer's gaze swept from Selena, calm, composed, to Hale, tense, agitated, too eager. "Step aside." Hale opened his mouth, then shut it. His hands curled into fists before he finally stepped back, his face burning. Selena exhaled, slow and controlled, watching as his authority unraveled before him. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start, and it was enough for today. As she turned away, earbuds back in place, she resumed her jog, her pace steady, her breath unshaken, and behind her, Hale watched, his power for the first time slipping through his fingers. A line-crossed Officer Thomas Hale reached for his handcuffs, his frustration boiling over as he took a threatening step forward. "Turn around, hands behind your back." But Selena Grant didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, her voice dropped lower, carrying a weight that cut through the tension like a blade. "Officer, I'm telling you, back off. You have no idea who I am." There was no fear in her tone, only quiet certainty, and that certainty infuriated him. To Thomas, her calm was defiance, her self-assurance an insult. He had expected fear, submission, not this unsettling composure. His jaw tightened as he lunged forward, grabbing her arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced force. But before he could lock her in place, Selena moved. Quick, controlled, effortless. With a sharp pivot, she slipped out of his grip as if she had anticipated his every move. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The moment stretched in stunned silence. Thomas stood there, his hands still outstretched, his pride bruised, his pulse pounding. Then his face twisted with fury. "That's resisting arrest," he bellowed, his voice cracking with frustration as he yanked his radio to his lips. But Selena didn't run, didn't panic. Instead, she leveled her gaze at him, eyes steady, voice calm but unshakable. "No, officer." She took a slow step forward, her presence alone commanding the space. "That's me reminding you that you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." Something flickered in his expression. Hesitation, a moment of realization. But pride is a dangerous thing. And Thomas Hale was a man who would rather destroy himself than admit he was wrong. His grip on the cuffs tightened. "You've resisted long enough." He seized her wrist, the metal biting into her skin as he snapped the cuffs into place. The crowd erupted. Outrage crackled through the air. "What the hell are you doing?" She didn't do anything, shouted a young man, his phone recording every second. Let her go, an older woman cried, her small dog pulling against its leash as if it too sensed the injustice. Nearly every onlooker had their phone raised, documenting, bearing witness. For the first time that morning, Hale felt the pressure. It crept into his bones, made his hands tremble ever so slightly, but he clenched his jaw, doubled down, refused to bend. He turned back to Selena, tightening the cuffs just enough to make her wince. Still, she didn't react, didn't fight, didn't plead. Instead, she simply looked at him, and that disappointed, knowing gaze unnerved him more than anger ever could. You're making a scene, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight he couldn't place. That only made him angrier. You made the scene, he shot back, pushing her toward the patrol car. All you had to do was cooperate. Selena didn't resist as he guided her into the back seat, but just before he slammed the door shut, she turned her head ever so slightly, met his eyes, and spoke words that would haunt him. I warned you, a pause. By the end of today, you'll regret this. Hale stiffened. He swallowed hard, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping into his gut. He slammed the door shut. Yeah, we'll see about that. His voice lacked the confidence it once had. The weight of lies Hale's fingers fumbled with the radio, his breath unsteady as he pressed the button. This is Officer Hale, Oakwood Park. I've detained a suspect, violent, resisted arrest, requesting immediate backup. His voice cracked ever so slightly. The crowd gasped. Violent, a woman shrieked. She didn't even touch you. We've got it all on video, a man yelled. You can't lie your way out of this. The murmurs turned to outright condemnation. Hale's chest tightened. He had lost control, but still, he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he waved them off. Clear the area. This is a police matter. But no one moved. No one backed down. As the patrol car pulled away, the phone stayed up. The voices stayed loud. And Selena? She leaned back against the seat, her expression unreadable. But the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. Not smug, not triumphant. Just knowing. Because she understood something that Hale hadn't yet grasped. The truth was already chasing him down, and it was faster than he could ever hope to outrun. The moment Thomas Hale stepped into the station, a wave of relief washed over him. This was his domain, his turf. The weight of the onlooker's judgment still clung to him. But here he was in control, or so he thought. He strode toward the booking desk, his grip on Selena's arm still firm. One for trespassing and resisting arrest, he announced, dropping her paperwork onto the counter with an air of forced confidence. She got a little feisty back there. Selena raised a brow, watching him with the patience of someone who knew exactly how this would end. She said nothing. She didn't have to, because the moment the station's doors swung open, the entire room shifted. Captain Marina Blackwood entered like a storm. She was a woman who commanded silence without raising her voice. Sharp features, piercing gaze, a presence that swallowed the room whole. And right now her anger was unmistakable. Hale! Her voice cracked like thunder. Hale stiffened, his pen freezing mid-signature. His heart pounded. Slowly he turned. Captain Blackwood, Save it. She strode forward, slamming a tablet onto the counter. The screen glowed. A video. A live feed. Hale's own voice filled the room. His accusations, his aggression, his blatant abuse of power. It had spread. Viral. The world had already seen it. Trespassing? Resisting arrest? Blackwood's voice was thick with disbelief. Feisty? Her lip curled in disgust as she held up his paperwork. Then she looked at him, eyes like ice. Do you even know who this is? Silence. Hale swallowed hard, his mind scrambling. She said she lived in the area. She's Selena Grant, Blackwood cut in, each syllable sharp enough to wound. She let the weight of the name settle before delivering the final blow. The head of internal affairs for the state police department. The color drained from Hale's face. His boss's boss. Selena stepped forward, her wrists now free, her stance unshaken. She met his eyes, her voice soft but razor sharp. I told you. A pause. You'd regret this by the end of the day. And he did. Because in that moment, Thomas Hale realized what it felt like to be powerless. The reckoning, Thomas Hale stood frozen, his world narrowing to the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Captain Marina Blackwood's gaze was cold, unreadable, but her movements were swift and decisive. Pull his file, now. Her voice cut through the air like a whip, and another officer scrambled to comply. Seconds stretched into minutes, thick with tension. Then the screen flickered to life, and there it was. Every misstep, every abuse of power, every time he had wielded his badge like a weapon instead of a duty. A pattern of stops, disproportionately targeting black and minority individuals. Minor infractions fabricated from thin air. A disturbing number of use of force incidents, each one ignored, buried beneath the weight of an unchecked system. Warnings from supervisors, dismissed. Complaints, unanswered. It was all there, laid bare in the glow of the station's monitor for everyone to see. A quiet murmur passed through the room as officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some shook their heads. Others looked away. But there was no looking away for Thomas Hale. His sins had been carved into stone. Selena Grant stepped forward, her voice steady, unwavering. Officer Thomas Hale. Each syllable fell with the weight of a gavel. You haven't just violated my rights. You've betrayed the trust of this community. You've tarnished the integrity of this department. And it ends. Today. A sharp breath, a shift in the air. Then Marina reached out. With one swift motion, she ripped the badge from his chest, a symbol of authority, stripped away in an instant. His mouth opened, but no words came. His hands twitched at his sides, desperate to grasp at something, anything to keep himself from unraveling. You are officially relieved of duty. Her voice was steel. Effective immediately. Another pause. Suspended without pay, pending further charges. For the first time in his life, Thomas Hale felt powerless. The badge had been his armor, his weapon, his shield. And now? Now he was just a man without power, a man without protection. The room was so silent he could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. His face burned with humiliation. This isn't fair, he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know who she was. Selena turned to him then, her expression unreadable, her eyes calm yet unyielding. You didn't have to know who I was. A pause. You only had to treat me with the respect that every citizen deserves. And you failed. Those words landed like a final verdict. And then, the world erupted. The fall. The video of Thomas's arrest had already begun spreading across social media before he even stepped into the station. Now, it was everywhere. News outlets ran the footage on repeat. Headlines screamed across screens. Racial profiling gone wrong. Corruption exposed. Head of Internal Affairs targeted by own officers. Justice in action. The outrage was instant. Social media boiled over. Calls for systemic reform grew louder. And at the center of it all, Selena Grant. That afternoon, she stood before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones raised like weapons of truth. Beside her, Captain Marina Blackwood stood tall, her expression grave but resolute. Selena's voice was calm, but there was a fire beneath her words, an unshakable conviction. This is not just about one bad officer. Her words cut through the noise. This is about a culture that allows this behavior to go unchecked. That ends now. We will hold every officer accountable, starting here. A swell of applause, cheers. A rare moment where hope outweighed cynicism. Thomas stood on the sidelines watching as the world rallied around the woman he had tried to silence, watching as his name became synonymous with corruption, watching as the thing he had spent his life building, his career, his reputation, crumbled into dust. The legacy of a moment in the months that followed, Selena's impact only grew. The investigation into the department unearthed more than anyone had expected. More officers faced scrutiny, more abuses were exposed. And change, real, tangible change, began to take root. Policies shifted, oversight increased. Reform wasn't just a promise anymore, it was happening. And at the heart of it, Selena Grant. She became a national figure in the fight for police accountability. Her arrest video, once shocking, became a rallying cry. She stood before crowds, spoke on national platforms, sat across from world leaders and demanded better. She refused to let the moment pass without meaning. The public hailed her as a symbol of resilience, of justice, of change. Meanwhile, Thomas Hale's world had shrunk to the size of a parking lot, stripped of his badge, his certification revoked, his name tarnished beyond repair. His job, once one of authority and control, was reduced to handing out parking tickets. Under the blistering heat of the afternoon sun, he stood in a nearly empty lot, faded yellow lines stretching beneath his feet. And then, a flicker of movement. Through the window of a nearby diner, a TV glowed. Thomas squinted, the familiar face on the screen making his stomach clench. Selena Grant, standing at a podium, a prestigious award in her hands. The room around her filled with applause, a standing ovation. Her expression, gracious, proud, unshaken, was the same one she had worn the day she warned him. The day she told him he would regret this. And standing there, sweat trickling down his temple, a ticket book hanging limply from his fingers, Thomas Hale finally understood what she had meant.